Don't call, don't come. 5 words. That's all my father could spare after 31 years of me being his daughter. Not even a period at the end, like I wasn't worth the punctuation. He sent that text at 4:47 in the afternoon, on a Tuesday in March, while I was standing in the parking garage of Methodist Hospital in Houston, still wearing my surgical cap, still smelling like betadine, and the particular exhaustion that comes from standing for 11 hours over someone's open chest cavity. I read it twice. Then I put my phone back in my coat pocket, sat down on the cold concrete next to my car, and stayed there for a while. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed the way they do when one tube is about to die. I counted the oil stains on the floor. 7. I noticed a crack running along the base of the wall that looked like the Trinity River if you squinted. And I thought about how strange it is that you can hold a human heart in your hands at work, keep it beating, keep it alive, and then read 5 words from your father that make you feel like you never had one of your own. By midnight, he called me 9 times, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire Russo. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at Houston Methodist, and this is the story of how my father tried to erase me from his life and ended up erasing everything he thought he knew about his own. I grew up in Katy, Texas, about 30 miles west of Houston, in one of those neighborhoods where every house looks almost identical, but everyone pretends theirs is special. My father, Richard Russo, sold commercial insurance and believed that this made him a man who understood risk. He talked about risk the way some men talk about football, with authority he hadn't really earned and volume that discouraged questions. My mother, Diane, had been a paralegal before she married him, and afterward she became the thing he introduced at company dinners as "my beautiful wife," before steering the conversation back to himself. She died when I was 17. Ovarian cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that particular cancer tends to be. She was diagnosed in October and gone by February, and in between there were moments where she looked at me from her hospital bed with an expression I didn't fully understand until years later. It wasn't fear, it was apology. She was sorry for leaving me alone with him. Not that he hit me. Not that he screamed or threw things or drank himself unconscious. My father's cruelty was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that makes you question whether it even counts. He simply never saw me. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean he would look in my direction and see a category, not a person. Daughter. Girl. Emotional. Soft. He had a system for the world, a ranking, and I existed somewhere below his golf buddies and slightly above the neighbors he tolerated. When I got into Rice University on a full academic scholarship, he told his friend Bill over the phone that it was nice, but she'll probably quit once she meets somebody. I was standing in the kitchen. He knew I was standing in the kitchen. The person who saved me, or at least the person who taught me that I was worth saving, was my grandfather on my mother's side. Nonno, we called him, because he was second-generation Italian and refused to answer to anything else. Giuseppe Ferraro. He'd come to Texas in the 1960s, worked pipeline construction in Odessa, lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a wrench accident, and never once complained about it. He played cards with 3 fingers and still won. He lived in a small house in Galveston with a screened porch that faced the Gulf, and the wood always smelled like salt and the particular mildew that coastal homes pretend they don't have. When my mother was dying, I drove to Galveston every weekend, and Nonno would make espresso on the stove in a dented Bialetti pot and sit with me on that porch and say almost nothing for an hour. He understood that sometimes the most generous thing you can give a person is silence. But he did say one thing, once, that I carry with me the way other people carry photographs. I was 23. just starting medical school, and I had come to him after a particularly brutal week. Anatomy lab, 16-hour days, a professor who told me I didn't have the hands for surgery. I sat on his porch and told him I thought about quitting, and he looked out at the water and said, "Claire, the people who underestimate you are handing you an advantage. Don't give it back." He said it so simply, like he was telling me the weather. And then he poured more espresso and asked if I'd seen any pelicans that morning. I think about that a lot now. About how he never raised his voice to make a point, and how my father never lowered his. About how Nonno's missing fingers held more warmth than my father's firm handshake. About how the men who talk least about strength are usually the ones who actually have it. My father remarried when I was 19. Sandra. She worked at the front desk of his insurance office and laughed at his jokes with a consistency that I suppose he found attractive. She was fine. That's the most honest thing I can say about her. She wasn't cruel to me, and she wasn't kind to me. I was a piece of furniture from his previous life, something she had to arrange herself around but never chose. They had a son together, my half-brother Derek, and when he was born, something shifted in the architecture of our family that never shifted back. Derek was the do-over. Derek was the version of a child my father actually wanted. A boy. Someone he could put on the football field and coach from the bleachers and call buddy and champ, and all the words he never once used for me. I want to be fair here. I want to say that I didn't resent a baby. And I didn't, not at first. I held Derek in the hospital the day he was born, and he grabbed my finger, and I felt what most people feel when a newborn grabs their finger, which is something enormous and impossible to name. But over the years, the contrast became its own kind of language. My father went to every one of Derek's games, every single one. He missed my white coat ceremony. He missed my graduation from medical school. I sent him a photo of myself on the steps of Baylor College of Medicine in my cap and gown, and he texted back, "Congrats, Derek scored 2 touchdowns last night." I remember staring at that text for a long time, looking for something hidden in it, some warmth I might have missed. There was nothing to miss. That was all there was. But I need to go further back than that, because the pattern didn't start with Derek. It started with my mother leaving. I was 7 when she packed 2 suitcases and drove away from our house on Westheimer Road in a silver Honda Civic that needed new brake pads. I remember the brake pads because my father had been complaining about them for weeks, saying he'd fix them when he had time, and my mother kept saying she'd take the car to Midas herself. That was their whole marriage, compressed into one argument about brake pads. She wanted things done. He wanted things done on his schedule. She left on a Tuesday morning in October, and the sound those brakes made pulling out of the driveway is something I can still hear if I close my eyes in a quiet room. My father sat at the kitchen table for 3 days. I made myself cereal. I made myself sandwiches. I went to school and came home, and he was still at that table. And I learned something at 7 years old that most people don't learn until they're much older. I learned that a parent can be in the room and completely gone at the same time. It was my grandmother who saved that period. My father's mother, Nana Ruth, drove down from Nacogdoches in her old Buick with a trunk full of frozen casseroles and a quiet fury she never once directed at me. She moved into our guest room for 4 months. She made me breakfast every morning, braided my hair for school, checked my homework with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She smelled like Jergens lotion and strong coffee, and she had this way of saying things that sounded simple but weren't. The phrase she said most often was this: "The tree doesn't chase the sun, baby. It just grows tall enough." I heard that dozens of times. When I cried because my mother didn't call on my birthday, When I came home from school because a girl named Megan Tully told everyone my mom ran away because she didn't love me. When my father forgot to pick me up from swim practice, and I sat on the curb outside the YMCA on Chimney Rock for 2 hours watching the parking lot empty. Every time, Nana Ruth would hold me against her chest and say it, and I'd feel her voice vibrate through her ribs into mine. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was about patience. It's not about patience. Nana Ruth went back to Nacogdoches eventually, and my father slowly came back to life. But he came back as a different version of himself. Harder, quieter. He threw himself into his work at the refinery and started treating the house like a place he slept rather than a place he lived. I became very good at being invisible, because invisible children don't cause problems, and children who don't cause problems don't get forgotten at the YMCA. That was my logic. It was flawed, but I was 8. I got straight A's. I cleaned the kitchen without being asked. I learned to cook real dinners by watching PBS cooking shows because I thought maybe if the house smelled like food when he came home, he'd stay in it longer. Sometimes it worked. Most nights he ate standing over the counter, watching ESPN, and said, "Good, Elise," without looking at what I'd made. Then Jolene came along when I was 12. She was a receptionist at a dental office in Katy, blonde and loud and always laughing, and my father became someone I didn't recognize around her. Attentive, playful. He bought her flowers. I'd never seen him buy anything that wasn't functional. He married her fast, less than a year after they started dating, and Derek arrived 13 months later, and the geometry of our family shifted in a way that made me the odd angle. Here is what I want to be clear about. Jolene was not cruel to me. She packed my lunches. She asked about my grades. But there was a membrane between us that never dissolved, and we both knew it was there, and neither of us tried very hard to break it. I was the artifact from the previous marriage, the quiet girl with dark hair who looked too much like the woman who left. I think my presence reminded my father of failure, and Jolene could sense that, and so the household organized itself around a simple principle. Derek was the fresh start, and I was the rough draft. By high school, I had decided to become a doctor. Not out of passion, not initially, out of architecture. I wanted to build a life so solid and so obviously valuable that my father would have to see it, would have to turn toward it the way you turn toward a sound you can't ignore. I studied with a discipline that my teachers called impressive and my classmates called obsessive. I got a full scholarship to UT Austin. I got into Baylor College of Medicine. I matched into emergency medicine at Houston Methodist. Every single milestone, I called my father first. Every single time, the conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. The thing about emergency medicine is that it selects for people who function well in chaos, who can hold 10 problems in their heads simultaneously and solve them in order of who will die first. I was built for it. All those years of reading a room, of watching my father's face for microscopic shifts in mood, of calibrating my behavior to avoid disruption. It turns out hypervigilance is a trauma response, and also an extraordinary clinical skill. I became very good at my job. I became one of the best in the department. Dr. Lena Okonkwo, my attending during residency, told me once that I had the steadiest hands she'd ever seen in a trauma bay. I didn't tell her that my hands were steady because I'd spent my childhood making sure nothing I held ever shook. But steady hands and a talent for crisis management do not protect you from the thing you carry in your bones. My father made sure of that. Let me tell you about the pattern, because it was not one event. It was never one event. It was a system, refined over decades, and I was its primary subject. The first time I understood that my father saw me as a utility rather than a daughter, I was 14. My mother had just been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. She needed surgery, then radiation, and somebody needed to drive her to appointments, manage her medications, keep the house running while she slept through the afternoons. My father had a landscaping business. He told the family he could not take time off. He told everyone he was the sole provider, that the mortgage depended on him, that sacrifices had to be made. What he did not tell anyone was that he spent 3 afternoons a week at Doreen Kazmarek's apartment on the other side of Brockton, playing cards and drinking Narragansett tallboys while his wife was in radiation, and his 14-year-old daughter was learning how to cook dinners for 4, do laundry, and administer anti-nausea medication in the correct dosage. I know this because Mrs. Pavlik next door told my mother years later, casually, not realizing it was a grenade. But at 14, I only knew that my father left at 7 in the morning and came home at 6, smelling like cigarettes, which was strange because he didn't smoke. And that if dinner was late, or the house was messy, or my brother Garrett's homework wasn't done, the silence from my father would last for days. Not yelling, never yelling, just the removal of acknowledgement. You stopped existing. He would look through you when you spoke. He would answer your brother but not you. He would set the table for 3. It is a very specific kind of cruelty, the kind that leaves no bruise and no witness, and when you try to describe it to someone later, they look at you like you are being dramatic. He just didn't talk to you for a few days. People have said that to me, therapists even, early on, before I found a good one. And you learn to stop explaining because the vocabulary for it does not exist in casual conversation. The second episode was my college graduation. I was the first person in my family to finish a 4-year degree. Suffolk University, magna cum laude, pre-med biology with a minor in chemistry. I had worked 2 jobs the entire time. I had slept an average of 5 hours a night for 4 years. My mother was in remission by then, and she came. She sat in the 4th row and cried when they called my name. My brother came too, bored and hung over, but he came. My father did not. He told my mother he had a job that couldn't wait, a big property in Milton that needed spring cleanup before the owners returned from Florida. When I called him that evening from the restaurant where my mother had taken me for dinner, Shrimp Scampi at a place on Hanover Street in the North End, he answered on the 3rd ring and said, "Good for you, Meg," and then asked if I could come by Saturday to help him with the books because his quarterly taxes were due. He did not say congratulations. He did not say he was sorry he missed it. He asked me to do his taxes, and I said yes. I said yes because I did not yet have the framework to understand what was happening. I thought if I was useful enough, consistent enough, invisible enough in my needs, he would eventually turn toward me with something that resembled warmth. That is the engine of the whole thing. You keep performing competence and hoping it will be enough. The 3rd episode was worse because it involved witnesses. I was 27, halfway through my emergency medicine residency at Boston Medical Center. My father had a 60th birthday party at my brother Garrett's house in Weymouth. Garrett's wife, Tina, organized the whole thing. I was working a 12-hour shift that day. I switched shifts with a colleague, drove 40 minutes in the rain, brought a gift I had spent 2 weeks choosing, a restored first edition copy of a fishing guide my father had loved as a young man. I had found it at a rare bookshop in Cambridge. It cost me $300 I did not have. When I arrived, the party was already in full swing. Maybe 30 people in the backyard, a tent, a keg, Garrett flipping burgers in a Red Sox apron. My father was in his chair, holding court. I walked over to him with the book wrapped in brown paper. He looked at the package, looked at me, and said in front of everyone, "You know you didn't have to come, Meg. I know you're busy with your important career." His voice had that tone, the one that sounds like teasing if you do not know him, the one that means, I want you to know that nothing you achieve will ever change your position in this family. Garrett laughed. Tina laughed. My father's friends from the VFW laughed. I handed him the book. He put it on the table without opening it and turned back to his conversation. I found it 3 months later in the donate pile at my mother's garage sale, spine uncracked. She did not know what it was. She said, "Your father goes through his things sometimes and clears out what he doesn't need." I bought it back for $2 from my own mother's folding table. I still have it. I do not know why. The fourth episode is the one that matters most, because it is the one where I almost broke. My mother's cancer came back when I was 30, stage 3 this time. She needed a full mastectomy, aggressive chemotherapy, and someone to manage her care because my father, who was now 63 and retired, said he could not handle it. Those were his words. "I cannot handle this, Margaret. You are the medical one." And so I became the medical one. I drove to Brockton every other day after my shifts. I coordinated her oncologist. I managed her port care. I held her hair the morning she decided to shave it herself, standing in the bathroom with my father's electric clippers. And I told her she looked like a warrior. She told me I looked tired. My father was in the living room watching the Patriots. He did not come into the bathroom. He did not come into the bathroom once during the entire 4 months of her treatment. And when I confronted him about it, quietly, in the kitchen, at 11 at night after my mother had fallen asleep, he set his coffee mug down and said the thing that nearly ended me. He said, "This is what you chose, Meg. You wanted to be a doctor. So doctor." And he walked out of the kitchen. I stood there holding a dish towel that smelled like my mother's lavender soap, and I felt something close inside me. Not with a slam, with a click, like a lock turning. I did not cry. I did not argue. I dried my hands. I checked my mother's IV line. I drove home to Somerville in the dark, and I sat in my car in the driveway for 22 minutes. And that was the only time in all of it, that I let myself come apart. That night in the car changed something. Not the way people describe change in movies, where suddenly the music swells and the protagonist stands up straighter and the world reorganizes itself around some new axis of determination. It was quieter than that, smaller. I sat in my Civic with the engine off and the windows fogging from my breath, and I cried until my ribs hurt, until my throat felt like I had swallowed gravel. And then I stopped. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my scrub top. I looked at the condensation on the windshield, and I traced one line through it with my finger. And something settled in me, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a glass of water that has been shaken for too long. It was not anger. It was not resolve, not exactly. It was recognition. The kind Grandma Lidka used to talk about when she said the word clearly. I could see clearly now. For 29 years, I had been trying to earn something that was never on the table. My father did not withhold love as a strategy. He was not playing a long game. He simply did not have the thing I was reaching for. He had obligation. He had expectation. He had a rigid internal architecture that sorted people into roles and kept them there, and that architecture had no room for a daughter who was also a full person. My mother was the wife, my brother Kevin was the son, and I was the useful one. I was the one you called when something broke, when something hurt, when someone needed managing. But you did not call the useful one to say thank you. You did not call her to say, "I see what this costs you." You used her, and then you set her back in the drawer like a tool, and you forgot she was there until the next time something broke. I understood this sitting in my car at 11:47 at night on a Tuesday in October with my mother's lavender soap still on my hands. And the understanding did not make me feel better. It made me feel emptied out. Like someone had taken a melon baller to my chest and scooped out the part of me that had been waiting. But emptied out was better than foolish. Emptied out was better than hoping. The next morning, I called Patricia Chen. She had been my faculty advisor during residency, and she had become, over the years, the closest thing I had to a professional mentor. I told her I needed a referral to a good estate planning attorney. She asked me why. I told her. She was quiet for about 10 seconds, which was a long silence for Patricia. And then she said, "Margaret, are you sure this is about estate planning and not about something else?" I said it was about both. She gave me a name. The attorney was David Rourke, offices on Federal Street downtown. I met with him on a Thursday afternoon during what should have been my day off. I brought a folder. I had spent 3 nights putting that folder together after my mother fell asleep, sitting at the kitchen table in Quincy with my laptop open and a legal pad beside me. In it, I had copies of every check I had written toward my mother's care, every receipt from the pharmacy, the documentation from Mass General showing my role as primary care coordinator, a printout of my student loan balance, which at that point was $312,000, and a letter I had drafted, not to anyone in particular, just to myself, outlining every financial contribution I had made to my parents since I turned 18. Summer jobs that went into the household, my portion of Kevin's bail the time he got a DUI sophomore year of college, the roof repair after the nor'easter in 2019 that my father said he would pay me back for and never mentioned again. 11 years of giving and giving and giving, all of it documented because some part of me, some quiet, organized, clinical part, had always known this day would come. David Rourke looked through the folder and looked up at me and said, "You put this together yourself?" I said I did. He said, "Most people come in here with a shoebox full of crumpled receipts and a vague sense that they have been wronged. You came in with an indexed binder." I said, "I am a trauma surgeon. I document everything." He almost smiled. We talked for 90 minutes. He explained my options. He told me things about Massachusetts estate law that I had half known but never fully understood. He told me about filial responsibility, about what could and could not be claimed, about the legal standing of informal caregiving arrangements. And then he said something I was not expecting. He said, "Dr. Kowalski, the legal picture here is strong, but I want to ask you a question that has nothing to do with the law." He said, "What do you actually want? Not what do you deserve, not what are you owed, but what do you want to happen?" I sat in his office on Federal Street with the noise of downtown Boston filtering through the window, and I thought about it. And I said, I want my father to know what he did. Not for revenge, not to punish him. I want him to see the actual shape of what happened because I think he has genuinely never looked at it. I think he has lived inside a version of this family where everything just worked out, where the bills got paid and the crises got managed and the mother got cared for, and it never occurred to him to ask who was doing it. I want him to have to look. That is what I want. David Rourke nodded slowly and said, "I can work with that." I did not tell my father. I did not tell Kevin. I did not tell my mother, who was by then in her 3rd week of remission and starting to walk the neighborhood again, slowly, with me beside her. I went to Quincy 3 times a week. I cooked, I checked vitals, I adjusted medications, and I said nothing about David Rourke or the folder or the plan that was taking shape on Federal Street because Grandma Lidka had been right about one more thing, a thing she told me when I was 16 and furious about something I cannot even remember now. She took my face in her rough hands and she said, "Malgorzata, listen. The people who talk about what they are going to do never do it. The people who do it never need to talk. So you decide which one you are." I decided. The first thing I did was nothing. I want you to understand that. For 2 full weeks after David Rourke said he could work with what I had, I did absolutely nothing visible. I went to work at Mass General. I did my shifts in the trauma unit, 12 hours on, 12 off, the fluorescent hum and the smell of iodine and the constant beeping that you stop hearing after year 3. I drove to Quincy on my days off. I made my mother's pierogi, the ones with potato and cheese, the way Grandma Lidka taught me, pressing the edges with a fork because she always said fingers leave the dough too thick. I sat with my mother on the porch while she drank ginger tea and watched the dogwoods along Hancock Street losing the last of their September color. I smiled. I asked about her appetite, her energy, her next appointment at Dana-Farber. I was a good daughter. I was the same Goja I had always been. But underneath that, very quietly, I was dismantling everything. David Rourke had given me a list. It was short and it was specific. He needed 3 years of financial records from my father's roofing company, Noack & Sons, which was ironic because there had never been sons, only a daughter who answered phones and filed invoices every summer from age 14 to 22 and never got paid for it. He needed documentation of every payment I had made toward my parents' mortgage, which was in my father's name alone, even though I had been sending $1,200 a month for 6 years. He needed proof that the cottage in Falmouth, the one on Surf Drive that my father bought in 2019 and told everyone at church he paid for with a good year in the business, had actually been purchased with money wired from my savings account. And he needed the trust documents from Grandma Lidka's estate, which my father had handled as executor and which I had never been allowed to see. I already had most of it. That is the thing about being the quiet one, the one they ask to organize, to file, to keep the books because she is careful, because she does not complain. You end up with copies of everything. I had been keeping records since I was 23 years old, not because I planned to use them, but because something in me, some instinct I could not name, told me to. Grandma Lidka's instinct, maybe. The instinct of a woman who survived things that should have killed her and learned that paper is more reliable than people. I gathered it at night. After shifts, when I should have been sleeping, I sat at my kitchen table in the apartment on Beacon Street in Somerville with a mug of black coffee and a banker's box, and I organized 6 years of bank statements, wire confirmations, mortgage payments, and tax filings into a story that was so clear it almost told itself. $1,200 a month to the Quincy mortgage, $68,000 wired to my father's account in March 2019, earmarked for the Falmouth cottage, which was titled solely in his name. My name nowhere on the deed. $14,000 in direct payments to the contractor who rebuilt my parents' kitchen in 2021, receipts signed by me, my father telling the neighbors he had done it himself. David looked at the numbers and did not say anything for a long time. Then he leaned back and said, "Your father owes you roughly $240,000 in documented transfers alone, and that is before we even open the question of the trust." The trust was Grandma Lidka's. She had set it up in 2014, 3 years before she died, with a lawyer in Plymouth, not my father's lawyer, her own. She told me about it once, sitting in that kitchen on Water Street with the blue kettle whistling. She said she had made sure I would be taken care of. She said my father would handle the paperwork because that was proper, because he was her son, but that I should know the money was meant for me. 50-50, she said. Half for Tadeusz, half for Malgorzata. Equal. She tapped the table when she said it, like she was nailing the word down. My father had never mentioned the trust after the funeral, not once. When I asked, 3 months after Grandma Lidka died, he looked at me like I had said something vulgar and told me there was nothing left, that the medical bills had eaten everything, that I should be grateful the house sold for enough to cover what was owed. I believed him. I was 27 and grieving, and I believed my own father. David Rourke's paralegal found the trust filing in Plymouth Probate Court in less than a day. The original balance was $412,000. The medical bills, which were real, had taken roughly $90,000. The remaining $322,000 had been distributed in a single transfer to my father's personal account. My half, $161,000, had never been dispersed to me. It had been absorbed, quietly, without a word. I sat in David's office on Federal Street, and I looked at the number, and I felt something I did not expect. I did not feel rage. I felt tired. A deep, old tiredness. The kind that lives in your bones. The kind that makes you realize you have been carrying something so long you forgot it had weight. I thought about Grandma Lidka's hands pressing the fork into dough. I thought about her saying, "The people who do it never need to talk." So I did not talk. My father called me that week to ask if I could come Saturday to help Kevin move a couch into the Falmouth cottage. My cottage, in a sense, paid for with my money, furnished with my labor, titled in someone else's name. I said, "Sure, Dad." I said I would bring lunch. I drove down on Saturday and carried the couch and made sandwiches, and Kevin did not say thank you, and my father did not say thank you, and I smiled, and I cleaned up, and I drove home, and I called David Rourke from the parking lot of a Dunkin' Donuts on Route 3, and I said, "File it. File everything." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I have never been more sure of anything." He filed the civil claim on a Tuesday. Breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, conversion of trust assets, constructive fraud. The papers were served to my father's house in Quincy on a Wednesday afternoon by a process server who knocked on the door at 4:15 while my father was watching the Red Sox pregame. I know the exact time because my mother called me at 4:22. Her voice was strange, not angry, confused. She said, "Goja, your father just got some papers, legal papers. He is sitting at the kitchen table and he is not speaking. What is happening?" I said, "Mom, I love you. I will explain everything, but not tonight." 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the lobby of the Norfolk County Probate and Family Court in Canton. It was a Thursday morning in October. The leaves outside the courthouse were turning that specific New England rust that always reminded me of Bobcha's kitchen curtains in the old apartment on Dorchester Avenue. I had not slept well. I had eaten half a blueberry muffin from the vending machine near the metal detectors and thrown the rest away because my stomach would not hold it. My attorney Kevin sat beside me, reviewing his notes. He had a yellow legal pad filled with numbers. Account numbers, routing numbers, dates, dollar amounts, 18 months of wire transfers, 2 forged signatures, 1 power of attorney document that my grandmother had supposedly signed 11 days before she died, when she could not hold a pen, when she could not lift her hand to her own mouth to drink water through a straw. Kevin had told me the night before that the judge assigned to our case was Margaret Sullivan, who had a reputation for being thorough and impatient with dishonesty, and that this was a good thing for us. I remember thinking that I did not care who the judge was. The numbers spoke for themselves. My father arrived at 9:45. He was wearing a navy sport coat I had never seen before, and a tie that looked like it had been knotted by someone else. My mother was not with him. My brother Tomek was not with him. He had hired an attorney named Paul DiMaggio, no relation to the baseball player, a man from a small firm in Braintree who handled mostly real estate closings and DUI cases. My father walked past me without looking at me. His attorney nodded at Kevin. Kevin nodded back. We all went into the courtroom. Here is what I had expected. I had expected my father to fight, to argue, to present some elaborate explanation for where the money had gone, to claim that Babcha had wanted him to have it, that the transfers were gifts, that I was the ungrateful daughter making trouble because I had been left out. I had prepared myself for anger, for his voice rising the way it always did when he felt cornered, that particular bass note that had made me shrink as a child and now made me sit straighter. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter and in some ways worse. Judge Sullivan reviewed the filings. She asked my attorney to present the timeline. Kevin stood and walked her through it. He was calm and precise, the way good attorneys are, the way I had learned to be in my own work. And he laid out the withdrawals month by month. $42,000 in March, $28,000 in April, $61,000 between May and August, in a series of smaller transfers designed to stay under reporting thresholds. The trust account that Babcha had set up at Rockland Trust in 1997 with the proceeds from selling the triple-decker on East Cottage Street. The account that was supposed to be split equally 3 ways between me, Tomek, and my cousin Anya in Chicago. The account that now had $1,100 in it. Judge Sullivan looked at my father's attorney. She said, "Does your client dispute these figures?" Paul DiMaggio stood up slowly. He said, "Your Honor, my client does not dispute the withdrawals." There was a silence in the courtroom that I can only describe as the sound of air leaving a room. He said, "My client maintains that Mrs. Kowalska verbally authorized these transfers and intended them as compensation for years of care he provided." Judge Sullivan asked if there was documentation of this verbal authorization. DiMaggio said, "No." She asked if there were witnesses. He said, "My mother, Helena Kowalska." She asked if Mrs. Kowalska was present. He said no. Judge Sullivan removed her glasses and set them on the bench in front of her and looked at my father directly. She said, "Mr. Kowalski, I am looking at a power of attorney document dated September 14th of last year with your mother's signature on it. I am also looking at medical records from South Shore Hospital indicating that on September 14th, your mother was under palliative sedation and had not been conscious for approximately 48 hours. She paused. "Can you explain this to me?" My father opened his mouth. No sound came out. He closed it. He looked down at his hands on the table. His attorney put a hand on his forearm. My father did not move. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing above us. I could hear someone's phone vibrating in the hallway outside. I looked at my father's hands, and they were shaking. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor, like a man holding something too heavy for too long. He said, "I took care of her." His voice cracked on the word care. He said, "For 6 years, I took care of her. I drove her to every appointment. I cleaned her house. I changed her sheets. I did everything, and nobody helped me, and nobody thanked me." He was not looking at the judge. He was looking at me. His eyes were wet and red, and for a moment I saw not the man who had texted me, "Do not call, do not come," but the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle in the parking lot behind St. Adalbert's Church when I was 5. Who had held the back of the seat and promised he would not let go, and then let go, and I had ridden all the way to the fence without falling. Judge Sullivan let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Kowalski, caregiving is admirable. Forging a dying woman's signature is a felony." She said she was ordering a full forensic accounting of the trust. She said she was freezing my father's personal accounts pending the results. She said she was referring the forged power of attorney to the district attorney's office for potential criminal review. My father's face went white. Not pale, white, the color of copy paper. His attorney whispered something to him, and my father did not respond. He stared at the table in front of him as if it contained instructions he could not read. I did not speak. I sat with my hands folded in my lap the way Babcha used to sit during Mass at St. Adalbert's. Very still, very straight, watching the altar as if she could see something the rest of us could not. I thought about what she had told me in her kitchen when I was 12. She had said, "Gosha, a woman who knows her own worth does not need to say it out loud. The room will feel it." The room felt it. The hearing ended at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the courtroom wall when Judge Kaminska closed her folder and said the words, "Temporary injunction granted." My father's attorney asked for a continuance. The judge said she would schedule a follow-up hearing within 60 days. She reminded both parties that the frozen accounts would remain frozen until the court determined rightful ownership of the disputed assets. She looked directly at my father when she said that. He did not look back. I walked out of the courthouse on Solidarnosci Avenue into gray November air that smelled like diesel and wet leaves. My attorney, Pan Kowalczyk, walked beside me and said nothing for half a block. Then he said, quietly, that was one of the cleaner outcomes he had seen in probate disputes of this kind. He said the forged power of attorney alone could result in charges carrying up to 5 years. He did not say this with satisfaction. He said it the way a doctor describes a diagnosis. Factual. Precise. I thanked him and he shook my hand and crossed toward the tram stop on Marshalkovska. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I felt like someone who had been holding a very heavy object for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down, and now her arms did not know what to do. The first call came at 9:42 that evening. I was sitting in my apartment in Mokotów, eating bread with butter, because I had not been able to eat anything more substantial all day. My phone lit up with his name. Tata. I let it ring. It rang 7 times and stopped. The second call came at 10:15. I let that one ring too. The third call came at 10:51, and this time he left a voicemail. I listened to it standing at my kitchen window, looking out at the courtyard below where someone had strung Christmas lights too early, little white dots against the darkness. His voice on the message was different from anything I had heard from him before. Not angry, not commanding, stripped. He said, "Gosia, please pick up the phone." He said, "We need to talk about this." He said, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." He used that word, misunderstanding, as if 23 years of being told I was less could be resolved by a brief clarification. I did not call back that night. The next morning, Dorota called. My sister-in-law, Marek's wife, the woman who had stood in Babcha's kitchen wearing Babcha's apron as if she had earned it. Her voice was careful and controlled. She said she was calling because the family was concerned. She said my father was very upset. She said I needed to understand that what had happened in court was painful for everyone, and that perhaps I should consider withdrawing the complaint for the sake of family unity. She used that phrase. Family unity. I almost laughed. I said, "Dorota, when was the last time anyone in this family was concerned about my pain?" She was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "That was not fair." I said, "No, it was not." Then I hung up. Over the following 3 weeks, the calls kept coming. Not every day, but often enough that a pattern emerged. My father would call late at night, usually after 11, when I think Marek and Dorota had gone home and he was alone in the apartment on Grujecka Street with the television on and nobody to perform for. His voicemails grew longer. In the first ones, he was measured, strategic. He talked about the family name. He talked about what Babcha would have wanted. He talked about how the courts do not understand family matters. Then the tone shifted. By the second week, he started saying things that sounded almost like honesty. He said he did not understand why I had done this. He said he had always provided for me. He said the word provided as if it covered everything, as if putting food on a table and a roof over a child's head was the full definition of fatherhood, and nothing else was required. I saved every voicemail. Pan Kowalczyk had told me to. The financial results came in stages. The forensic accountant's report, delivered to the court in early December, confirmed what I had suspected. Over 800,000 zloty had been moved from Babcia's accounts in the 14 months between her diagnosis and her death. Most of it had gone into an account held jointly by my father and Marek. Some had been used to pay down the mortgage on Marek's apartment in Ursynów. 46,000 had gone to renovate the apartment on Grujecka Street. The accountant noted that none of these transfers bore Babcia's actual signature. They bore the signature from the forged power of attorney. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation in January. My father was not arrested, but he was required to appear for questioning. Marek was also called in. I learned this not from them, but from Pan Kowalczyk, who received the notification from the prosecutor's office. It was in late January that Ciocia Eva called me, my father's younger sister, the one who lived in Gdansk and came to Warsaw only for funerals and name days. She was 71 years old, and she had a voice like gravel and warm milk. She said, "Gosia, I have something to tell you, and I want you to listen." I sat down on my bed, and I listened. She said she had known for years that my father treated me differently. She said she had spoken to him about it once, in 2014, after Babcia's 80th birthday, and he had told her to mind her own business. She said she had not spoken up again, and she was sorry for that. She said the word sorry, and then she was quiet, and I could hear her breathing, the faint whistle of an old woman's lungs through a phone connection stretching across 300 kilometers of Polish winter. Then she said something I will never forget. She said your Babcia told me once that you were the only one in the family who listened with both ears. I did not know what to say to that, so I said, "Thank you, Ciocia." And she said, "No, do not thank me. I should have called years ago." After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. Outside my window, the snow was falling on Mokotów, slow and deliberate, covering the parked cars and the bare lindens along the street. I thought about Ciocia Eva sitting in her apartment in Gdansk, looking out at different snow, carrying her own guilt for her own silence. I thought about how families are not single stories, but dozens of stories running parallel, and how the people inside them so often choose not to compare notes until it is too late, or nearly too late, or just barely not too late. I was not too late. Babcia had made sure of that. Even from wherever she was now, she had made sure of that. I kept coming back to Babcia's words. Not the famous one, not the phrase about quiet women and deep wells that everyone in the family had heard at least once. The other one. The one she said to me on a Tuesday afternoon in her kitchen on Maszałkowska, when I was 19 and had just failed my first university exam and was sitting at her table crying into a cup of herbata that had gone cold. She put her hand on mine. Her fingers were thin and warm, and they smelled like the lavender soap she bought at the pharmacy on Puławska. She said, "Zosia, you will spend your whole life learning the difference between patience and cowardice. They look the same from the outside. They feel the same for a long time. But patience builds something. Cowardice just delays the collapse." I had written that down in a notebook later that night, not because I understood it, because I did not understand it, and I knew someday I would need to. Now, sitting in my apartment 20 years later with snow still falling and my father's voicemails still on my phone, and Chocha Eva's apology still warm in my ear, I finally understood what Babcha meant. And the understanding was not comfortable. It was not the kind of clarity that makes you feel righteous. It was the kind that makes you sit very still and look honestly at yourself. Because the truth is, I had been patient. I had been genuinely, deliberately patient. I had waited for the right documents, hired the right lawyer, prepared everything with precision. I had not acted out of rage. I had acted out of certainty, and I do not regret any of that. But before the patience, there had been cowardice, years of it, and I needed to be honest about that. When my father first started treating me as an afterthought, I was not being patient. I was being afraid. Afraid of losing the only parent I had left after Mama died. Afraid that if I confronted him, he would confirm what I secretly feared, which was that he simply did not love me as much as he loved Bartek and the new family he had built with Dorota. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself I was being mature. But mature people speak. I was just quiet. There is a difference. When Dorota made that comment at the Vigilia dinner about how some people contribute to a family and some people just show up, I smiled. I actually smiled. I told myself it was not worth the argument. But it was worth the argument. It was worth it that night at that table in front of Bartek and my father and the cousins. Instead, I swallowed it and drove home to Mokotov and sat in my car in the parking lot behind my building and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and cried so hard my ribs hurt. That was not patience. That was a woman too afraid of her own anger to let it exist. I think about the years I spent sending money. The transfers to cover Bartek's driving lessons, his school fees, the down payment help that Dorota asked for through my father, as though I were a bank and not a daughter. Each time I told myself I was being generous. And generosity was part of it, maybe. But part of it was also purchase. I was trying to buy relevance in a family that had already decided I was peripheral. You cannot buy your way into being loved. I know that now. I think I knew it then, too, somewhere underneath the transfers and the careful politeness. Babcha saw it, of course she did. She saw everything from that apartment on Marshalkovska, watching through her window and through her phone calls and through the things I did not say when I visited on Sundays. She tried to tell me in her way. She tried with the proverb and with the small comments and with the look she would give me when I mentioned my father. That particular tilt of her chin that meant, "Zosha, you are lying to yourself and we both know it." But she could not make me ready. Nobody can make another person ready to see their own cowardice clearly. That is work you do alone, usually too late, usually in the dark, usually after something has already broken. What I have now is not revenge. I want to be very precise about this. My father lost his claim to Babcha's apartment not because I wanted him to suffer, but because Babcha wanted me to have it. Dorota lost her fantasy of renovation money not because I schemed, but because it was never hers. The documents Magister Kowalski presented in court were not weapons. They were facts. Facts that had always existed, that my father chose not to think about, that Babcha had quietly arranged over years because she understood something I was still learning, which is that love without structure is just sentiment, and sentiment does not survive contact with greed. But I would be lying if I said there was no satisfaction when I saw my father's face in that courtroom. I would be lying if I said I did not feel something sharp and bright when Judge Novitska read the dates on those documents and my father realized how long, how carefully, how completely Babcha had planned this. There was satisfaction. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then it was replaced by something much heavier, which was the recognition that my father was a man in his 60s sitting in a courtroom, learning that his own mother had not trusted him, and that she had been right not to. I do not feel sorry for him exactly, but I feel the weight of it. I feel the whole stupid, heavy sadness of a family that could have been honest with each other and chose not to be, year after year, until honesty arrived anyway in the form of a legal ruling and a notarized will, and a woman in a black robe reading numbers into a microphone. I could have spoken sooner. I should have. Not about the will, not about the apartment, about everything else. About the Christmas I was uninvited from. About the money that was never acknowledged. About the way Dorota spoke to me and the way my father allowed it. I should have said this is not acceptable, and I should have said it in 2016, in 2018, in 2020, every single time. Maybe it would have changed nothing. Maybe my father would have chosen Dorota and Bartek anyway. But I would have had the knowledge that I had spoken, and that is worth something. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes silence is just silence, empty and enabling, and the only person it protects is the person causing the harm. Babcia knew the difference. She was patient when patience was building something, and she spoke when speaking was required. She arranged the will. She told the lawyer. She kept the receipts. That was not cowardice dressed up as patience. That was a woman who understood exactly when to be quiet and exactly when quiet was no longer enough. I am 43 years old. I am still learning the difference, but I am learning it. There is a bench in Łazienki Park that faces the water. It is not a famous bench. It is not near the Chopin Monument where the tourists sit on Sundays. It is further south, past the palace on the Isle, near the old orangery where the light comes through the trees in a way that makes everything look like it belongs to a different century. Babcia used to take me there when I was small enough that my legs dangled off the edge and my shoes did not touch the ground. She would bring a thermos of tea and 2 bread rolls from the bakery on Nowy Świat, the one with the green awning that closed in 2011, and we would sit without talking for a long time. She said once that the water in the park was not really a lake, it was a canal dug by hand hundreds of years ago, and that sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that someone built slowly, on purpose, when no one was watching. I went back to that bench last Thursday. It was late October. The trees along the water had turned the color of rust and old gold, and the air smelled like wet leaves and the last warmth of the year burning itself out. I sat there for almost 2 hours. I did not bring a thermos. I did not bring bread rolls. I just sat with my hands in the pockets of my coat and watched the surface of the water hold perfectly still, then ripple when a duck landed, then go still again. My father has not called in 19 days. Dorota has not called at all since the hearing. Bartek sent one text message, 4 days after the ruling, that said only, "I hope you're happy now." I did not respond. There was nothing in those words that was actually asking me a question, and I have learned by now that not every sentence that ends deserves an answer. The apartment on Mokotowska is being prepared for sale. The estate lawyer, Pan Kowalczyk, says the process will take 3 to 5 months, depending on the market. The building needs a new roof, and the electrical system has not been updated since 1987, so the price will reflect that. But even so, Mokotów is Mokotów. The estimate is just over 2 million zloty. My share, plus the savings accounts Babcia left directly to me, comes to slightly more than I earned in the last 4 years of military service combined. I have not decided what to do with it yet. I know what Babcia would say. She would say, "Do not decide quickly. Quick decisions are for the battlefield. Money decisions are for Tuesday mornings when you have slept well and eaten breakfast." I did speak with my father once more, 6 days after the courthouse. He called at 7 in the morning, which is early for him. His voice was different. Not softer exactly, but thinner, as though something behind it had lost its structure. He said he wanted to understand why Babcia had done what she did. I told him the truth, which is that she never explained it to me directly, but that I believed she wanted to make sure that the person who had carried the family's invisible work did not leave empty-handed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I carried things too, Kasia." And I said, "I know you did." Because he did. He carried the weight of being the favorite child and never questioning what that cost the people around him. And that is its own kind of burden, even if he never saw it clearly. He did not say he was sorry. I did not ask him to. There is a version of this story where everything resolves, where my father comes to Łazienki Park and sits beside me on that bench and says the exact right thing, and I forgive him completely, and we walk out together into some golden afternoon and the music swells. That is not what happened. What happened is that I sat on a bench alone and watched the water and felt something I had not felt in a very long time, which was the absence of waiting. For 30 years, I had been waiting for my father to see me, waiting for Dorota to acknowledge what I gave, waiting for Bartek to thank me, waiting for someone to say, "Kasia, you mattered. You were here. We noticed." The waiting is over now, not because they finally said it, because I stopped needing them to. Babcia's phrase comes back to me sometimes at night, when the apartment is dark and the city outside is doing that thing Warsaw does in autumn, where the trams sound far away and everything feels suspended between what was and what will be. Patience is not weakness, Kasiu. Patience is choosing your moment. She was right. But I would add something to it now, something she maybe knew but never had to say out loud because she had already lived it. Patience is choosing your moment, yes, but you also have to choose it. You have to actually arrive at the moment and open your mouth and let the silence end. Otherwise, patience becomes a room you never leave. I left the room. If you are sitting somewhere right now listening to this, and you recognize the feeling I am describing, the feeling of carrying something heavy while everyone around you pretends you are carrying nothing, I want to tell you one thing. You are not invisible. You only feel invisible because the people closest to you have gotten comfortable not looking. That is not your failure. But staying silent until it crushes you is not your responsibility either. You are allowed to set the weight down. You are allowed to say, "This is mine, and you cannot have it." You are allowed to choose your moment. The bench is still there, by the water, past the palace on the aisle. The trees are probably bare by now, but in the spring they will come back, the way they always do, slowly, on purpose, when no one is watching.